All right, all right. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining me here on the Transportation and Logistics Clubhouse. Very excited to be here on this Monday evening. We have very special guest in OOIDA, who is the Owner Operator Independent Drivers Association. Very excited to talk about the updates that we've had since our first session. But before we begin, I'll go ahead and start with this. Look, measure what you want to improve. And I say that because, I had the opportunity to participate in my second ever 5K event. It was the ATL 5K this past weekend on Saturday. And, out of 2,100 people, I finished 99th overall. All right. So I improved since my very first 5K performance, probably by about a minute, maybe 45 seconds to a minute. But I wanted to get a certain time. I wanted to get 24 minutes flat, and I was off. You know what I mean? I was off by probably a minute. But it just made me understand that although I set a goal that was probably ambitious, I feel very empowered to get there next go around because I saw how I performed. Now I have different insights on how to prepare for this next go around. But yeah, all that to say, if you want to improve at something, set up some metrics, measure it. Go back and evaluate what you did measure, and just come back at it a different way. So that's that. I was very excited and happy to share that with you guys. We also had some other participants from the Transportation and Logistics Clubhouse join me. So that was also very, very awesome. So without further ado, we do have OIDA on the stage. I'm going to let these gentlemen go ahead and introduce themselves, starting with Bryce. Bryce, let the folks know who you are, brother.
Yeah, thank you, Jory. My name is Bryce Mungeon. I'm the Director of Legislative Affairs for OOIDA in our Washington D.C. office. So, with myself and Colin, we're leading OOIDA's efforts on Capitol Hill, anything involving legislation.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And Colin, how about you, brother? Can you please introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Colin Long, the Director of Government Affairs at OOIDA. I sit next to Bryce in our office in DC, and we come up with ways to help truckers through policy both on the legislative front and the regulatory front.
Nice. I love it. I love it. And, this is our second go at it. And I feel like a lot of good stuff
Yep.
has happened since. But for the people who were not around, I'm just going to give a quick play by play. Okay. So we're talking AB5. And we're saying that AB5 is the law that reclassifies workers from independent contractors to employees. And to do that, we have to see about the ABC test, which basically says unless an employee or unless a person meets all three of these criteria that I'm about to say, they have to be considered an employee. So, number one, they are free from the control and direction of the hiring entity when performing their work. Number two, the work performed is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. Number three, the work is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, or business. And you know, the second one is the one that there's going to be a lot of difficulties getting around if someone did want to continue to operate as an independent contractor. All right. So the law is affecting roughly 70,000 owner operators in California. And to date, the only options that were really presented to those people who were independent, owner operators were to either move out of Cali, get an authority, and change their status as someone who's leasing on to being able to make their own calls and call their own shots, and don't pick up outbound loads. You know what I mean? So just not operate in that area if you're an owner operator. So those are the basics, I would say, from our original conversation. And like I said, there has been a lot that's transpired since our first discussion. And I just wanted to open it up with either of you gentlemen to say, like, when it comes to Judge Roger Benitez, how important has he been to OOIDA's position thus far?
Yeah, so I think kind of what you're referring to is the court's decision and a judge's decision to grant OOIDA's request to intervene as a petitioner, basically join as a party to the ongoing lawsuit in California. And so it's extremely important that we've been able to join the lawsuit as a party, because this now means that our views will most certainly have a seat at the table. The views of our members and of owner operators more broadly will be represented as part of this case, and I think that's what's really important is for I say so many people, but kind of like generally speaking, you have CTA, the California Trucking Association. They're representing the largely carriers, that perspective in the trucking industry. They're representing the size of bigger business side of the perspective of bigger businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the state and the Teamsters representing the union perspective of this issue. And what gets lost so often is the owner-operator perspective, or those people who actually, they stand to lose out on the business model that they've been using for a long time. And so that's why it's so important that the judge granted our request, and why it's so important why we're participating and part of this. And the other perspective that we bring is the interstate perspective in this case. Up to this point, CTA is representing the California, California-based businesses. So we bring, businesses that run into, out of, through California, because we have members across the country. So, that decision is important for a number of reasons, and we're glad that the court granted the request.
Yes, sir. It seems like he's been an advocate for you guys for quite some time. I'm not saying that, I'm not saying too much by that, but if you look at the history of what has been said, I do think, and I think that the way he's interpreted has aligned with you guys for quite some time. And it's very exciting to see where we're going with this. One of the biggest update since then, though, is the introduction. Well, actually, I'm gonna let you guys introduce it. But to segue into it, we have the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was you know created in 1938. Okay, and that Labor Standards Act essentially was taking into account all the folks who were potentially working 40 hours or more, and saying, hey, you guys should do what? Actually, I'm gonna throw that one over to you guys. What does that talk about?
Yeah, no, sometimes it's better when you do it, because I'll get into it and just go way off into the deep end, into the details. But no, I think you're explaining it well. And basically, what's happening is OOIDA has made progress in making sure that employee truck drivers can get paid overtime, and they're guaranteed overtime pay like most other blue collar workers. And I should say, what we're about to talk about directly relates to employee drivers, but if this legislation were to be enacted, it would have a broader effect across the trucking industry, and a broader positive effect for owner operators and drivers across the industry. Because if you're improving wages, improving rates, and improving working conditions for employee drivers, we know that's going to, a rising tide lifts all boats. So to get into a little bit more of the specifics of it, basically, as you started to detail, going all the way back to 1938, you have the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA, which is a whole host of labor laws. But as part of that, it required employees to be paid time and a half after they worked 40 hours in a week. Like I'm sure most people know, overtime after 40 hours in a week. But the law carved out, at the time, it's been expanded, but there were two exceptions to that law. And one of them was truckers. It was for employees that fell under the authority of the Department of Transportation. Their working hours were under DOT. And part of the thinking with exempting truck drivers was that we don't want, it's out of safety. We don't want drivers incentivized to work more hours in a week. But 1938 was a long time ago. A lot has changed in the trucking industry, to say the least. Especially with deregulation in the 80s, you have a case where instead of making sure that drivers don't work too many hours, the exemption from overtime has really resulted in drivers' time being devalued. And now as we know, drivers work 50, 60, 70 hours in a week. So to put it shortly, the overtime exemption devalues truckers' time. It makes truckers treated differently than most other blue-collar workers. And the bill that has been introduced, it's the Got Truckers Act. It's very simple legislation. It would eliminate that exemption. So it just would strike the exemption under current law that says that drivers don't have to be paid overtime. So I'm sure we'll get into the details more, but that's it. It's really as we think of it, about as simple as it gets. It's just eliminating a provision in law. We, in a lot of ways, thinks it's a deregulatory thing when you think about it. We're not creating new regulations. We're not trying to regulate pay, but we're just saying, hey, make sure truckers are treated like everyone else, and it'll solve a lot of the issues that we see in the industry with pay, working conditions, and a lot of other things. So that's it in a nutshell. Colin, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, I feel like you're the play-by-play guy, Bryce, and I'm just here for color commentary
Well, you can add your color commentary if you'd like. And I guess I should say that the reason we're kind of focusing on this again. One is because the legislation was just introduced in the Senate by Senator Padilla from California back, it's about a month ago now, but in September. And we had Congressman Andy Levin introduce the same legislation in the House back in the spring. So we have a bill in the House, have a bill in the Senate. And why we thought it would be appropriate to talk about this with you and your audience is to show that, what OOIDA is trying to do is protect small business trucking, but also improve the small business environment and improve working conditions for all truckers. So while we're trying to protect that independent contractor owner operator model, we're also pursuing policies that, one, we just think are good policies. It makes sense to treat drivers the same way as everyone else, but two, we're trying to do things that are I think people don't often think as trucking as like not saying we're pro labor, but pro worker. We're trying to do things that will help to improve compensation for drivers. So I think that's why we wanted to bring this up and just kind of mention it to talk a little more broadly about what we're doing for drivers and compensation.
And Bryce, just to be clear, I think it's important to clarify that the Got Truckers Act and the removal of the exemption in the Fair Labor Standards Act would only apply to employee or company drivers.
Yep.
So if you're an owner operator, this largely won't have an impact on you. And I only say largely simply because we think it might actually improve rates for folks. If shippers and receivers are suddenly having to account for potential overtime pay, uh, like Bryce said earlier, we think a rising tide lifts all boats. It might actually improve conditions for owner operators as well, because people will finally start having some sort of financial stake in the game when it comes to providing compensation for drivers. So there are certainly going to be secondary benefits to this, and we think that's one of them. Another one we obviously think will be a reduction in detention time. I know detention time is an increasing problem in our industry. If anything, Congress should be stepping in to take steps to remedy the excessive detention time our members are wasting waiting to be loaded and unloaded. We think this proposal will actually decrease a lot of that time because it finally puts value on all the hours a trucker of any classification puts into moving freight. So we think there's a lot of good associated with this bill that will affect folks who aren't necessarily the target audience, who aren't necessarily company and employee drivers who would be directly affected.
Yes, sir. Oh, yes, sirs. I truly appreciate that. I appreciate that because this has even affected me and my business. As the owner of Atlanta Dispatch, I do have a particular brokerage that I use, or at least I partner with every single day. Every day out of the week, I'm moving some type of freight for them, and because they own a warehouse that is notorious for having, long hold times. They just said they're no longer going to be paying detention at all. And,
Hmm.
it's because if they do, they take the loss on every load. And, it's my job to be fair to, both sides of the coins. I represent the trucker. That's my job as a dispatcher, is to get the highest rate for
Mhm.
the carrier. But I do understand the position of the warehouse. Prayerfully, like you gentlemen just said, this coming into account will actually put more attention on increasing, making a more robust infrastructure so that,
Mhm.
that detention time is not happening as consistently. And were you about to say something?
No, keep going. You're on a roll.
Okay, cool, cool, cool. So look, I did want to ask this, in
Mhm.
you guys' opinion, is there anybody in particular that still believes that this exemption, let's talk about the exemption itself or the provision.
Mhm.
It is, I believe, the provision of section 207, and it says that the title shall not apply to respect to so the maximum hour requirements will not apply to any employees with respect to whom the Secretary of Transportation has power to establish qualifications and maximum hours of service pursuant to the provisions of Section 31502 of Title 49. Now, with that being said, do you guys know anybody in particular that still believes this exemption is valid all the way from 1966?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise, but carriers who don't treat their drivers well, or who don't want to have to deal with paying overtime or have to start worrying about paying their overtime to drivers have come out in opposition to this. So it's not a surprise to us that carriers would oppose this. And again, that's a general statement from what we've seen. The American Trucking Associations, they kind of sent around a quote unquote fact sheet about what the effects of this would be and how it would be problematic. And what they're saying is, look, drivers already get paid well. We already factor in detention time and waiting time when we're paying drivers, by the mile. And they, kind of try and say this will re-regulate trucking, and a number of other, kind of things that they throw out there. But I mean, I think the bottom line is it's just kind of talking in circles. We know that drivers are not mileage based pay does not account for detention time. There's no way that if you get held up for an hour or two, your pay is suddenly going to change on the back end because you were held up for that time. And we already know that carriers are tracking every mile that drivers drive, every hour, every minute that they work. So we know they have all of this information. And implementing it certainly would take some changes, and it would be an adjustment. But just because it might be a little bit difficult, or it might mean that things have to work a little differently, doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Just because something's been, cheating drivers out of pay and devaluing their time for this long doesn't mean we should keep on doing it. So, we know that carriers aren't fans of this, and I apologize, Colin. I can't remember who it was that made the comments. It was actually a group, or someone representing shippers, or at least speaking to a group of shippers, and they basically said if this were to take effect, there's no way we could pay drivers for all their time. Like, it wouldn't be sustainable. So we know that they know that the system works for them right now, and why would they want to change that? I guess is kind of, if I were in their shoes, sure. Why would I want to do something that's going to make it more expensive for me to run my business?
Yeah, they'll often say, "Well, who's going to pay for this?" And we'll tell them, we'll remind them, you know, drivers are currently
Yeah,
paying for
exactly.
this by not getting compensated for all the time they work, or not getting even fairly compensated if they are accounting for all the time they work. So we think the burden shouldn't be on us to say how people are going to pay for it. It should be on those opposing this to say, well, why aren't you paying your drivers a sustainable wage? Why aren't you paying drivers in a manner that reduces your turnover below 90% to 100% annually? And those are the questions that should be asked. And I think that helps expose the kind of inherent unfairness of compensation in the trucking industry right now for drivers.
And I think just the one thing to kind of add to this is, we've been asked, like, what do you, like, how would this work? What would happen if this were to go in effect? And those are obviously very fair and good questions. And I think the number one thing that we've been saying is it would finally force everybody in the supply chain, carriers first of all, but shippers, receivers, warehouses, or everyone else, to value every hour that a driver works. We also think that it may lead to increased compensation for drivers, because if they're now eligible for overtime pay, obviously if they're working more than 40 hours a week, they may see increased wages after that point. But we also aren't naive. We know that if this were to take effect, carriers would likely rework their rates to account for this change, and drivers would probably be taking home maybe similar, but maybe a little bit more pay. But we think that the bottom line is finally, someone would be on the hook if a driver's kept longer than they should be. So even though a carrier may rework rates and may try to account for these changes, if a driver gets held up, that means they'll finally be compensated a little bit more for that time. So again, I think we expect there will be some changes. It may not be an enormous change to the bottom line compensation, but we think the bigger change will be in the way that drivers' time is finally respected. And hopefully, maybe you're taking home the same amount of pay, but you don't have to work 60, 70, 80 hours in a week to get that.
Gotcha. No, I definitely hear you guys. Let me just throw this out there. Just like there's a minimum wage in certain areas and maybe certain fields, do you feel like there should be like some minimum structure to the compensation of drivers? And, when it comes to that whole concept of uh, giving them more, and that's how you retain them, like that just be the sweetener on top?
I mean,
We're both going to point to each other probably, but
no, I mean, I think. Oh, I have a good thought, but I don't know if you had one too.
Go for it. Let's see where this goes.
I mean, I was going to say I think this is kind of our answer to any sort of,
Yeah.
A question of should there be some sort of minimum wage or minimum rate in the trucking industry. I mean, technically, drivers are supposed to be paid the minimum wage, and but the federal minimum wage doesn't come out to very much, especially for the work and the hours that drivers are putting in.
Yeah.
But with the overtime, by eliminating the overtime exemption, we think that's kind of like letting the market and letting the industry take care of some of those issues. That question you just asked is something that we've discussed among ourselves, among our board members, with our members. Is should there be some sort of minimum pay for detention time, or should there be some sort of minimum rate or something like that? And the challenge is you'll find pretty much a different answer from everybody, and you'll find a lot of people are like, do not get the government involved in this issue at all. That's the last thing I want.
Yeah.
So by eliminating this exemption, I mean, you're kind of accomplishing some of those goals. It's a way for allowing drivers to be paid more fairly, but you're not putting in some new crazy idea. You're just saying, hey, why not treat drivers like most other employee workers? So I think this is kind of, we think, one of the best ways to, improve rates and kind of get people to pay attention to those things without having to put a number to it. And Colin, I don't know if you have a different thought.
No, that's perfect. If anything, this would avoid the necessity to require a minimum wage.
Yeah.
I mean, that's ideal. Certainly, there will be challenges to that, but that's the general thinking that you're going with, Bryce, and I think you're right.
No, I love it. I mean, it does make me think about just the normal operation of an owner operator or one of my clients of those accessorials. You brought up a good point of what if there was a minimum amount or required amount for detention pay. I do think it's slightly, rude still that in things like tow news, truck orders not used, they don't have there's technically not a minimum there. You can do a lot of driving to get to a shipper in good faith, thinking that the load is going to be good, and now you've consumed all this fuel, all this time, all of this wasted opportunity that could have gone to another opportunity, a high paying opportunity, but you're at the whim of the broker, and whatever regulations they have in their broker carrier agreement, to say how much that time and that energy and that fuel to get to that shipper is worth if the load is no longer good. You know what I mean? So it's crazy that I see a tow going anywhere from $150 to $600.
Hmm.
It's too wide a range, especially when we're not valuing the opportunity that was lost. You know what I mean? The cost of that opportunity of taking that and it not going through. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not really a huge guy on regulation,
Hmm.
but I do see how it could benefit at least some of my clients. So I'm very open.
Yeah, and we often get comments from members that uh, they want us to avoid additional regulations, and they see this as us pushing for more government intervention in the industry. We contend it's the opposite. I mean, we're trying to get rid of a regulation that is entirely outdated, no longer makes sense for the industry, and prevents a lot of folks in trucking from being compensated fairly. So if you're for reduced regulation, you got to be for the Got Truckers Act, because it's literally getting rid of an outdated policy that no longer has any sort of reality in trucking.
Nice, nice, nice. So, look, if the individuals who hear this in the future, the fleet owners who hear this, if they're also in favor of this getting passed, what would the call to action be?
It's going to be reaching out. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's reaching out to your lawmakers in Washington, D.C., in both the House and the Senate. Like Bryce mentioned, we've got bills in both chambers now. Reaching out to your members of Congress and your senators and telling them to support the efforts. We're kind of winding down the legislative year this year, which is unfortunate, because had we had these introduced a little bit earlier, we may have had a little bit more success getting them through the Democratic controlled Senate and House, to be quite honest. But we're already lining up folks to introduce the bills in 2023. I'm not sure what the political atmosphere will look like, but we'll still need support from a number of House members, a number of senators. And while we have a bipartisan bill in the House, it's primarily Democrats supporting us on these issues. And we think there's opportunities to appeal to Republicans to get them on board. But that won't happen without truckers picking up the phone or getting on their computer and reaching out to these elected officials who represent them in Washington and saying, it's time to get rid of this outdated requirement that only affects me and treats me differently than other folks in a blue collar industry like trucking. So it's advocacy, it's grassroots advocacy. That's what makes the difference.
I got you. I got you. Let me ask this about this. The GOT Truckers Act. Does
Hmm.
it feel good to be kind of like in alignment, or the same goals, to have the same goals with Teamsters, and does it feel good to be working towards the same thing?
I
I
mean,
mean,
I
we sorry, Bryce,
no, go
we
ahead.
agree with others in our industry and we fight others in our
Yeah.
industry on a daily basis. This just feels natural to us. I mean, if the Teamsters are prioritizing making sure that drivers are compensated fairly and their wages allow them to have really fruitful careers in trucking, we're going to be right there with them. But we're going to battle them on things like AB5, where it jeopardizes the classification that our members like. And we'll be with the California Trucking Association and the ATA on the AB5 issue, but when it comes to compensation and overtime pay, we're gonna fight them tooth and nail. So the beauty of OOIDA, and sometimes the frustration of OOIDA, is we are the wild card in trucking. We'll work with folks when we see eye to eye, and we'll fight you tooth and nail on other ones.
I did notice that. A lot of the people that you are supporting and are supporting you, being able to be an intervener with
Hmm.
AB5 are some of the same people that are opposed to this act. So it's just interesting. I wanted to hear your perspective, and I thought it was funny because it's just like, how do you balance, Do you guys, if you were to have a conversation with some of the thought leaders at some of those other organizations, those memberships, would it all be pleasant, or would it spew over to something that now you're bumping heads? Is that the climate?
Yeah, I mean, we talk to these organizations all the time, whether it be collaborating on issues where we do see eye to eye, or just trying to get a better understanding of why they oppose some of our efforts, and why we fight them on some of theirs. And these conversations happen routinely. I mean, all the time in Washington. And frankly, it's just the nature of the advocacy world. I don't think this is necessarily limited to trucking. I think this happens in all kinds of industries, and we're really no different. But the difference is that OOIDA really represents the small business interests in trucking, and I think that's fairly unique as far as industries are concerned. There aren't necessarily so many industries working here in Washington on behalf of their members, where you're kind of exclusively representing the interests of small businesses and people who make their living behind the wheel. That's what makes OOIDA unique, and that's what forces us to work with some of our enemies, and fight some of our friends, and it at least keeps things interesting. And I think from our perspective, we're fairly straightforward in our advocacy. People know where we're going to come down on a lot of these issues, but we still have the conversations with our friends and with our enemies, and it's just the way you get results, I guess you could say.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay. Well, look, you did mention AB5, so let's just go back there for a second. Because there are some things that are coming up, as a result of AB5, and some of the companies, some of the carriers that were allowing owner operators to lease onto them are now being forced to decide what they are going to do to stay in compliance. And it seems as though there's been a few models that people are starting to move towards. One being every driver, every owner operator becoming an employee. We also have that two-check model where they're getting a paycheck for doing the work, but if they had their own truck, they were also receiving a check for essentially leasing it to that company. So the two-check model. And the third one is that transportation company that was allowing folks to lease onto them, now moving towards the brokerage model. And do you guys have any particular opinions about either of those three? I mean, the one that I want to talk about the most is that last one, the brokerage model. But are there any thoughts on what you think is the best if people did have to make a decision?
I think Bryce, you may have a different opinion, but I think it's difficult to tell people to go one route because of the
Mhm.
diversity of operations and what people are comfortable doing. I think it's also fairly early in the implementation of the bill to determine what may work best for folks. I think people are still kind of guessing because there's that lack of clarity coming from California. We're not even sure what types of plot twists there are down the road on this issue. So Bryce, am I wrong in saying that it's difficult to pinpoint one strategy that'll work for everyone?
No, you're 100% right on that. And I think especially because of the last point you mentioned, which is we don't know we don't know how the state's going to enforce the law yet. We don't know how the court is going to interpret the state's enforcement of the law. So uh, from what we've seen and kind of what we've heard out of the state, those models that you mentioned, Jory, or those solutions, or whatever you want to call them, those do seem to be ways to be compliant with the law. But it's still, we don't know 100%. We don't know how the state's what they're going to do. But as a result of our ongoing challenge to the law, we may learn something, or the court may decide something that, opens up another possible way for people to be compliant with the law. There's that business to business exemption that's in AB5, which is basically, if you'll bear with me for a second, a 12, I forget, it's either a 12 or 13 part test that you have to pass. And if you meet every one of those 12 requirements or 13 requirements, then you can go run the old classification test to see if you're an employee or independent contractor. But long way of saying there's a lot of different things that I think are yet to be decided for the court and for the state to kind of decide how are we going to interpret each one of those business to business requirements. So I think at this point, I don't think we're like necessarily giving advice to people, but I think the advice is kind of just to to wait and see what comes out of this. It's not our sense that the state is moving to crack down on a small owner operator immediately right now. And then I also think the thing that bears repeating too is for owner operators, the the penalties and the burden for compliance falls on the carrier. So if you're an owner operator that is with a carrier, and the court somehow finds that the carrier is in violation, it's not like the owner operator is going to see penalties. Certainly, it's a big concern for the owner operator. How do I manage my business and continue to operate in the state? But just kind of putting this all out there to show that there's a lot that still needs to be worked out and figured out. And certainly now is the time to be trying to figure those things out, trying to get answers, and we're pressing our case in court. But I don't think we're at the point yet where the state's moving in ready to like put big penalties on owner operators or anything like that.
Yeah, and Bryce, I think moving forward, there has to be this kind of back and forth relationship between OOIDA and our members and truckers
Mm-hmm.
at large. I mean, we are intimately involved in this issue. We will pump out information as we get it. We will provide insight and guidance when we can, but we also need truckers to relay what they're experiencing to us, what they're being told by motor carriers, brokers, whoever is telling them what they need to do to be compliant in California. Let us know, because that will help us figure things out for all of our members and for truckers who use us as a resource. So I hate to say stay tuned, because we're now in the implementation time period, but things still need to be worked out. If you hear things, let us know, and we will continue to pump out information on public platforms, but also to our members as well.
No, I completely understand where you guys are coming from, and I don't want you to feel crazy, because that is where we are. We're still waiting to see how it's going to
Yeah.
be enforced. So no, you make some very good points with that. From the dispatcher perspective, when I was learning how to dispatch, when I was working for a corporation, this is what I was getting to when I saw the brokerage. Way of doing things for a trucking company to then go add on a brokerage authority. Was I was told if I saw both of those on the same MC, or a company that had both of those licenses or those authorities, to stay away from them, and stay away from them, because they have all the fixings and trimmings and all that stuff to be a double brokerage operation. And
Yeah.
and not to mention that California is a hotbed for folks who operate in that market, especially ones that do a lot of virtual assistants from different locations across the world. I've learned that, in other places, double brokers, they just believe that it's a normal part of the game, and it's just because the information that they're being force fed. So I'm interested to see how this is going to play out because of that. I actually, somebody reached out to me today and was asking me about my dispatch services, and I asked them for their MC, and I saw they had both of those things. Just a small carrier out of the Atlanta area, and I'm not. My first thought wasn't, oh, I don't, this is suspicious, but at the same time, it did make me think about my training of, this person may have the ability to do some double brokering, and that's not something that I can be a part of as a dispatch agent. So yeah, that's where I was going with that. And you guys have a lot of members that are in the California area. I know that people who have memberships with you get a lot of good perks, especially when it comes to tires. I'd imagine with trucks too. But I bring that up to say that with the California Air Resource Board's decision to kind of make more stringent requirements on the vehicles that can be used in drayage opportunities.
Mhm.
I believe that next year, going into 2023, the oldest model vehicle that can be used in the drayage arena is a 2017. How do you guys feel about that? Are you going to have resources for the owner operators to kind of to get newer equipment, in light of this more stringent requirement?
That's tough to answer. I mean, we won't necessarily be able to help you get vehicles, but uh, we certainly will raise concerns with California about what type of impact policies like that will have. Policies that just go entirely too far, because I think there's kind of a disconnect going on in California where people don't realize that uh, trucks are extremely expensive for someone trying to operate a business with a truck or a handful of trucks. That could destroy their business simply because they are probably operating older trucks, probably more efficient trucks. So it's difficult to not fight requirements that will continue to drive up costs for small businesses and for owner operators. So I don't know. I don't think we'll be able to help those folks purchase trucks, unfortunately. Uh, but we're certainly going to continue to fight policies that make the cost of operations so much higher. And we know that California continues to kind of lead the charge on these issues, and they want the cleanest vehicles imaginable to be using their roads and entering and exiting their ports. But sometimes that's just not practical, and sometimes it has real world implications on a lot of folks who make their living in that industry and have businesses in that industry. So we'll continue to be advocates for small business truckers on that front. But I wish I could give you some better incentives and some better promos to help lessen the blow.
No, I hear you. I hear you. I mean, it's kind of hard to say. And, this one right here is a little bit more tricky to me. And I say that because of, before I say this, I am not an expert. I'm not a scientist, and I've only seen very, very little peer data. Okay, so take this with a grain of salt, everybody. But it's just that concentration of areas that have the vehicles, the communities that have more
Sure.
diesel vehicles operating in that area. It's a little, it's poor quality air. It is bad. It is worse. And
Mhm.
I forgot where I heard this from. Maybe I got it from my wife. We were talking about uh kids that roll school buses or something about the amount of exhaust that people are exposed to and what
Sure.
it ultimately does for the community, for the environment, and just the health of that individual as a whole. So because I had just that little bit of
Mhm.
seasoning, it makes me say, I don't know what to do, because
Yeah.
Yeah.
obviously I care for the small trucking company that I know is barely making ends meet, but they're pushing and pushing and pushing, while also wanting to have a cleaner environment. So I'm a little bit torn on this one myself.
You,
Well,
you
I think
know, I.
one solution that's kind of being overlooked is improving the efficiency within our ports. I mean, I think everyone can agree having trucks spending the amount of time they do waiting to be loaded and
Mhm.
unloaded could be reduced, and that would probably contribute to cleaner air. I would assume. I mean, I'm sure there are studies on this, but take this with a grain of salt as well. But you think if you can improve efficiency getting in and out of the port, maybe you can allow some of those small businesses to continue to run trucks that frankly have pretty modern and clean engines. I mean, if we're talking about 2017, there were EPA emissions requirements that were pretty stingent put in place before that. I mean, we're squeezing kind of the last drops out of the grapes with emissions reductions. But I mean, why do we continue to focus on the technology and what the driver is operating rather than how efficiently they are getting in and out of the facility?
And just to, I only want to bring this up too because it's pretty recent, but there's an article in the Wall Street Journal from the last 2 days that
Mhm.
followed a driver working at an intermodal or around an intermodal facility in Chicago, and he was with the chassis shortage. Basically, he had to go like drive 40 minutes one way to pick up a chassis that had a cargo container on it, and then go drive it somewhere else just to unload that, to then drive back to where he needed to be to pick up his original load. Long way of saying he'd spent tons of time just driving around and waiting because of how things are all, goofed up, thrown out of whack, whatever you want to call it. But it kind of gets back to two things that we're talking about. One, all these inefficiencies that cause extra emissions that you don't need, but also all this enormous amount of time that's being wasted by drivers, and drivers oftentimes bearing the cost for that. So I think,
Because the
and
law allows that to happen, Bryce. You're missing the biggest part here. I mean, we're trying to
sure.
get rid of the situation where the driver has no value associated with the hours he or she spends working. So to the even bigger picture, I mean, this is because people have no financial incentive uh, to pay drivers for the time they work and to improve efficiency within the supply chain.
And
Sorry, Bryce.
no, and sorry, and I don't want to make too long of an answer, but kind of to bring it back around, Jory, to what you were talking about, and kind of just these regulations, in California specifically. A lot of time, what happens with these is there's just so many unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about the emissions regulations, the CARB regulations. Part of the results of what happened with previous CARB regulations that went into place is things like lease purchase agreements, and carriers trying to basically take advantage of drivers because drivers needed these new trucks but had no way to pay for them. And so that just opens up opportunities for people to take advantage of drivers. And kind of same thing as we look at what's going on with AB5, we're questioning, are there going to be ways that people are kind of quote unquote work around this, or are there new unintended consequences like owner operators having to get their own authority, having to get their insurance to now operate as their own carrier, which results in a lot of costs for small businesses. So it kind of makes you wonder, who is this ultimately helping? And what we're trying to do, and Colin touched on this, but with representation that we bring out of OOIDA, is bring truckers' voice to those conversations and try and say, like, hey, there's these really bad consequences that are going to happen that you're not hearing about from the large carriers because they can absorb some of these costs, or you're not hearing about from the Teamsters because they stand to benefit from where some of these changes may be. So I think that's what we bring at OOIDA, is that perspective. That, I mean, that's obviously what we do, is bring that small business trucker perspective, but to try and help get ahead of these unintended consequences that we can see coming, but everyone else either doesn't see or wants to ignore.
Yes, sir. Well, look, man. I thought
Amen.
those were great answers. Oh, my bad. Were you about to say something, Colin?
No, I just said amen.
Oh, yeah.
Bryce really nailed that one.
Yeah, I agree. I had a guest last Wednesday, Luis Molina of Canteneros. He worked the ports for over 10 years. And, I was asking him about some of the stuff that he wished he would have known when he got started. And, Bryce, you said the owner operator, the lease agreement, so that he could get a better truck, was one of the things that he would advise people against, because
Yeah.
he got taken advantage of. So I hear you with that one for sure.
Yeah, and I also have to kind of put a shameless plug in here too for for what we do at OOIDA. One of the other things is we offer business services to our members. So for drivers that are thinking about getting their authority, or thinking about getting into a lease purchase, which I think usually we say don't do that, but for anyone who's thinking about those things, you can call us up. Our business services can help to answer questions. We have around 300 employees, and we're dedicated to serving truckers. What we have also, just to take another example, we offer something called Truck to Success, where it's like a 3-day seminar that is kind of like a crash course on what you should know before you decide jumping in to the industry as an owner operator. I think, registration unfortunately is closed for the one we have coming up at the end of this month, but we run that we run that program regularly. So those are the kind of things that we also offer to our members, is just really a lot of information in addition to some of the other, like other services like fuel cards, things like that. But just information and assistance is really what we try and do for our members.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay. Well, I love it. If you guys were interested in becoming members of OOIDA, definitely reach out to these brothers, or you can go directly to the website. I'm pretty sure they're going to have all those details all nice and neat for you.
Mhm.
So I did want to put this out there. If there were any folks that were able to ask any questions, that maybe they had anything they wanted to get answered, this will be the time. I'm going to leave that open for about 30 seconds. And while that marinates, I'm just going to say, brothers, Bryce, Colin, I truly appreciate you guys coming back on to let us know what the updates have been since August. I think that we're definitely progressing, and I'm excited to see where this bad boy goes. And from here, I'm still just very, very happy to highlight all of the the wins, maybe some of the L's that people take as well. I'm just very happy to stay, on this subject, so that we can, just bring the information to the people. And if there was anything that you guys needed from me, let me know. I am going to go ahead and turn off hand raising because that was 30 seconds. Um, it's that simple. But did you fellows want to say anything before we close out the room tonight?
I would just say that we've been talking about these classification and compensation issues, but that is only scratching the surface of what we do here in Washington for truckers. I mean, we're continuing to push for truck parking resources being devoted on the federal level to expand truck parking capacity. We've had some good news come out of DOT recently about some big grants. They have awarded to Florida and Tennessee to build truck parking capacity. It's a good start. We need more. We need truckers to continue to weigh in with their elected officials in Washington about the need for safe, reliable, dependable truck parking. But even those are kind of our big issues. But we work to improve broker transparency. We work to reduce regulatory burdens that cost our members too much money and don't really have safety values. So we're happy to talk about these classification issues. They're very timely. They're very important. But we do we work on a number of issues that are very timely and very important to truckers, and you can check all that out on OOIDA.com. You can visit Fighting for Truckers. That's our advocacy specific page for more information on how you can get involved in advocacy as well. And we really encourage folks to do that because lobbyists can get a lot done here in Washington D.C., but so can constituents who pick up the phone and call their elected officials. I know a lot of folks are jaded about the government, but sometimes those conversations and those relationships can really have great value for what we're trying to do on behalf of drivers. So I encourage you to do it.
Yes, sir. Well, I truly appreciate that. I also I might want to have you guys back not only to talk about AB5 and GOT, but I might want you guys to talk about that transparency situation that's going on. Uh,
Sure.
to strike that ability for the trucking company to get access to some of those documents and some of those facts and figures on all the loads that they move. So just keep that in your back pocket for the next time. And Bryce, did you want to say anything before we close out, brother?
No, I think Colin covered it all. But again, we'll just encourage anyone who's interested or think they might be interested to go to our website ooida.com, to look at becoming a member. And also, even if you're not a member, fightingfortruckers.com, as Colin said, is our advocacy specific webpage. Sign up for emails there, and we pump out tons of good information. On these, like the big infrastructure bill, we put together documents with each specific section that deals with small business truckers. So we make sure to really dig down in details, and also let anyone who signed up there know how they can comment on regulatory things out, regulatory items that are issued, legislation, everything like that. So just a great way to stay involved through the resources we offer.
All right, perfect. Well, gentlemen, I'll just say thank you so much again, and I pray you have a strong week. For the members of the Transportation and Logistics Clubhouse, join us on Wednesday. We're going to be here on Wednesday discussing more of global logistics. So we're going to be talking with an NVOCC. If you don't know what that is, this would be the time to find out. So join us Wednesday, 7 p.m. And I look forward to hearing from you guys then. Have a blessed one, fellas.